So the printed out sheets of the patterns of all pieces of the garment are glued together. If you are into sewing, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. First, we will consider the patterns of the corset pieces. The forepart of the corset consists of 3 parts: central, intermediate, and side. The patterns of these pieces are the most ordinary ones. The only feature? The area of the cup is highlighted and shaded in gray. The back of the corset consists of 2 parts, the central and the side ones. In my particular case, I will not use the back of the corset in the garment. The explanation is very simple. My client is very slim, and she needs a jacket of about 44 in size. So the corset for her is also small. Such a figure does not need to be fully laced in the corset. It is enough to make the corset only in front and just to sew an elastic strip instead of the corset back. I will show you this technique. If your client needs a jacket of a size 48 or more, you have to make the back of the corset so that you make the jacket fit tightly to the client and to make her feel more comfortable wearing this garment. Therefore, you will need to cut out the pieces of the back of the corset to sew them and to sew the inside of the garment in a way I will show you in the subsequent lessons. The configuration of the side seams of the forepart and the corset back are absolutely identical. Moreover, when we begin to adjust the pattern of the jacket to the specific measurements of the client, I will transfer the corset side seam to the jacket pattern. We have reached the most important question, which is asked, as a rule, by almost everyone who uses the pattern. What is the size of the initial pattern and how to adjust it to the specific size of the client? Our particular case will not be an exception. We will have to sew the mock-up. But this time I am going to sew only the mock-up of the front part of the corset. You need to sew a full corset mock-up if you are going to make a full corset. But you will determine the measurements of the initial pattern by measuring the sewn mock-up. And you will take all measurements off your client in the same way I will show you. Let us talk about the pattern of our jacket before we move to the corset mock-up. First of all, I want to tell you what kind of pattern it is, what size it fits, how to work with it, and how to adjust it. I created this particular pattern according to a special technique based on just 2 measurements: bust circumference and hip circumference. You can see here the pattern of the back of the jacket. I have built everything above the waistline for the bust circumference of 86 centimeters. And the position of the waistline and all the parts which are lower than the waist had been calculated for the hip circumference of 98 centimeters. In other words, I have built the jacket pattern right according to the measurements of my client. I emphasize your attention at this moment precisely because you will have to adjust these patterns according to the measurements of your particular client. You can see the inclined secant lines on the sheets of the jacket pattern. These are the lines or guidelines which help you adjust the pattern. The pattern is constructed in such a way that if you change the measurements of the bust or hip circumferences by 2 centimeters, the size of the pattern changes by 0.3 centimeters in one or another direction along each secant line regarding the initial basic pattern. Let us consider the adjustment of the jacket pattern on the particular examples. I have drawn a small table where I put the initial data according to which the initial pattern of the jacket was built, namely the bust circumference, 86 centimeters, and the hip circumference, 98 centimeters. First, I want to calculate together with you how much we should change the basic pattern along the secant lines drawn on the jacket pattern when having other values of bust and hip circumferences. So let us suppose that your client's measurement of bust circumference is 82 centimeters. First of all, we find the difference of this measurement from the initial one. 82 centimeters minus 86 centimeters equals -4 centimeters. According to the rule, when changing the measurement of bust circumference by every 2 centimeters, we should measure 0.3 centimeters along all secant lines of the jacket pattern above the waistline. Therefore, in our particular case, we should measure by 0.6 centimeters to decrease the initial pattern along all secant lines of the jacket above the waistline. -4 centimeters divided by 2 multiplied by 0.3 equals -0.6 centimeters. Let us go to the measurement of hip circumference. Also, let us suppose that your client's measurement of hip circumference is 90 centimeters. First of all, we find the difference of this measurement from the initial one. 90 centimeters minus 98 centimeters equals -8 centimeters. Therefore, in our particular case, we should measure by 1.2 centimeters to decrease the initial pattern along all secant lines of the jacket pattern from the waistline and below. -8 centimeters divided by 2 multiplied by 0.3 equals -1.2 centimeters. I put the obtained data in the table. Let us consider one more example to consolidate. So, suppose that your client's measurement of bust circumference is 88 centimeters. First of all, we find the difference of this measurement from the initial one. 88 centimeters minus 86 centimeters equals 2 centimeters. According to the rule, when changing the measurement of the bust circumference by every 2 centimeters, we should measure 0.3 centimeters along all secant lines of the jacket pattern above the waistline. Therefore, in our particular case, we should measure 0.3 centimeters along all secant lines of the jacket pattern above the waistline in the direction of increasing the initial pattern. 2 centimeters divided by 2 multiplied by 0.3 equals 0.3 centimeters. Everything below the waist will need to be guided by the measurements of the hip circumference. As you understand, it does not at all mean that if your client's bust circumference is 88 centimeters, then the hip circumference should necessarily be 103 centimeters. Absolutely abstract figures are written in the table to explain the very principle of adjusting the jacket pattern. For example, with a bust circumference of 88 centimeters, the measurement of hip circumference can have any value. Therefore, let us calculate how should we change the jacket pattern on the waistline and below if the hip circumference of your client equals 107 centimeters. First, if the measurement of the circumference is an odd number, then to simplify the calculation, round it up to an even number. Therefore, we will calculate for the hip circumference of 108 centimeters. The difference of this measurement from the initial one is 108 centimeters minus 98 centimeters equals 10 centimeters. Therefore, in our particular case, we should measure 1.5 centimeters along all secant lines of the jacket pattern from the waistline and below in the direction of increasing the initial pattern. 10 centimeters divided by 2 multiplied by 0.3 equals 1.5 centimeters. To consolidate the knowledge and to understand better the process of adjusting the jacket pattern to the measurements of your client, I recommend to make the calculations and to fill in the table completely. Before I show you adjusting the standard jacket pattern to a specific example, it is necessary to consider changing the length of the pattern depending on the client's height. If you need to decrease or increase the length of the pattern, then draw a line parallel to the waistline through the point where the darts meet. Cut the pattern along this line and move together or move apart the pieces. Do the same on the back pattern. So let us change the pattern of the jacket forepart to the measurements of an abstract client. We will take the measurements and the calculated values from the table, and to complicate the work, we will consider the case when the upper part of the pattern should be decreased and the lower part should be increased. In this case, the client's bust circumference measurement should be less than the measurement of the standard pattern. For example, 82 centimeters. And the hip circumference measurement, on the contrary, should be larger. For example, 103 centimeters. According to the table, it follows that it is necessary to measure 0.6 centimeters inside the original pattern along all secant lines on the pattern above the waistline. And measure 0.9 centimeters along all secant lines to the side of increasing the original pattern on the waistline and below it. I will do the changes on a scaled down version of the jacket pattern, which is printed on the sheets how to match the sheets of the pattern. So, the pattern of the jacket forepart. It only remains to connect the obtained points. and the adjusted pattern of the jacket forepart is ready. I measure 0.6 centimeters inside the initial detail on the pattern of the jacket sleeve along all secant lines. This is what the jacket sleeve, changed according to the client's measurement, looks like. And just in the same way, we adjust the pattern of the back of the jacket. I believe you have made sure that this method of adjusting the pattern is very simple, convenient, and fast. And this method is very suitable for such garments which do not require precise fitting. Please note that all the patterns of the jacket have no seam allowances. Do whichever is more convenient for you. You can add seam allowances on the printed sheets of paper, or you can cut the adjusted pattern and add the allowances on the fabric. Do whichever you are used to, and according to your style of sewing and cutting.